This is AI True Crime. Tonight, we return to one of Hollywood's oldest unsolved murders. In our last episode, we traced the life and death of William Dean Tanner, the man the world came to know as William Desmond Taylor. Tonight, we begin asking the dangerous question Hollywood never wanted answered: who killed him? Chapter 1: The Assumption of Familiarity. From the very beginning, investigators made a critical assumption about William Desmond Taylor's murder. They believed he knew his killer. There were no signs of forced entry at the bungalow on South Alvarado Street. No overturned furniture. No struggle. Taylor was not shot while sleeping or ambushed from the shadows. He was standing upright, dressed neatly, in his own home. The bullet entered his back, suggesting he had either turned away from someone he trusted or never felt threatened enough to defend himself. This single assumption shaped everything that followed. If Taylor knew his killer, then the answer had to be found among the people already orbiting his life. Friends, colleagues, visitors. The circle was small, intimate, and already complicated by Hollywood's tangled relationships. But this assumption also narrowed the investigation too quickly. It pulled focus away from strangers, from professional criminals, and from motives that did not fit neatly into scandal. Instead, police and press alike turned their attention inward, toward the women in Taylor's life and the private dramas that could be easily sensationalized. Hollywood, at the time, was still fighting for legitimacy. Movies were no longer novelties, but they were not yet respectable. Studios were deeply aware that public opinion could turn hostile overnight. The Roscoe Arbuckle trials were still fresh in the public mind, and the industry could not afford another morality scandal. So when William Desmond Taylor was found murdered, the response was not just investigative. It was defensive. The crime scene itself reflected this tension. Police allowed neighbors, reporters, and studio representatives inside the bungalow almost immediately. Objects were handled. Drawers were opened. Personal letters were read. Evidence was moved, possibly removed, and never properly documented. Whatever clarity might have existed in the first hours after the murder dissolved almost instantly. Witnesses were unreliable from the start. Some had heard a gunshot. Others claimed they heard nothing. Several people reported seeing a man leave the bungalow shortly after the estimated time of death, but descriptions varied so widely they were nearly useless. Tall, short, well-dressed, poorly dressed, calm, hurried. The man became less a suspect than a silhouette, fading as more voices crowded in. What remained solid, at least in the public imagination, was the belief that the murder came from within Taylor's own world. This belief directed suspicion toward those who had emotional ties to him, particularly women whose lives were already under scrutiny. It was easier to imagine a crime of passion than a calculated act. Easier to sell obsession than planning. Easier to blame scandal than confront the possibility of something more organized and more dangerous. Law enforcement followed the path of least resistance. So did the press. By the end of the first week, the case was no longer about what happened inside that bungalow. It was about who could be made to represent the danger Hollywood pretended it did not harbor. And once that shift occurred, the truth began to slip away. Chapter 2: Mary Miles Minter and the Invention of Suspicion. When investigators and reporters began looking for someone to blame for William Desmond Taylor's murder, Mary Miles Minter was an easy target. Minter was young, famous, and emotionally vulnerable, all qualities that made her legible to the public in the worst possible way. She had been one of the most popular actresses of the late silent era, often cast as innocent, idealized young women. Off-screen, her life was tightly controlled by her mother, Charlotte Shelby, who managed her career, her finances, and much of her personal life. Taylor entered that world not as a romantic figure, at least not publicly, but as a mentor and trusted confidant. Their relationship was close. That much is undeniable. Taylor advised Minter on her career, helped guide her performances, and offered stability in an industry that often consumed young actors. Letters written by Minter after Taylor's death reveal deep affection and emotional reliance. They speak of admiration, devotion, and longing, but they do not describe violence, rage, or intent. None of that mattered once suspicion set in. The idea of a young actress driven to murder by obsession was irresistible to the press. It fit neatly into existing anxieties about Hollywood corrupting youth and blurring moral boundaries. Headlines framed Minter as unbalanced, emotionally dependent, and capable of extreme behavior. Her youth was turned into evidence of instability. Her affection was recast as fixation. Law enforcement questioned Minter, but there was no physical evidence tying her to the crime. She did not own a weapon matching the bullet used in the murder. There were no witnesses placing her at the bungalow at the time of the shooting. No confession. No credible motive beyond speculation. Still, the damage was done. Minter's career began to collapse almost immediately. Studios distanced themselves. Public opinion turned cold. The roles that had once been plentiful vanished. Even though she was never charged, the association with the murder followed her relentlessly. She became, in effect, punished without trial. What makes this particularly striking is how little investigative energy was actually spent testing the theory of her guilt. Once suspicion attached itself to her name, it seemed to satisfy a cultural need. The story required a figure to absorb blame, and Minter fit the role perfectly. Behind the scenes, attention began shifting to someone far more volatile and far more dangerous. Her mother. Charlotte Shelby was fiercely protective of her daughter and openly hostile toward William Desmond Taylor. She believed he exerted undue influence over Minter and had attempted to sever their relationship. Witnesses described Shelby as controlling, manipulative, and deeply resentful of anyone who threatened her authority over her daughter's life and career. Shelby owned a small-caliber handgun, reportedly similar to the type used in the murder. She had experience with firearms and was known to carry one. Some accounts placed her near Taylor's bungalow around the time of the shooting, though these statements were inconsistent and never conclusively verified. Others claimed she had voiced violent threats toward Taylor in the past. Despite this, Shelby was never formally charged. Investigators appeared hesitant to pursue her aggressively. Part of this may have been due to lack of physical evidence. Part may have been fear of the consequences of accusing the mother of a major star. And part may have been something darker. Shelby was well-connected, wealthy, and litigious. She knew how to fight back. In the end, suspicion hovered around both mother and daughter, but landed conclusively on neither. Mary Miles Minter faded from the spotlight. Charlotte Shelby retreated behind money and influence. And the case moved on without resolution. What remained was a template that would repeat again and again in celebrity crime. Find a compelling narrative. Attach it to a recognizable face. Let public judgment do what the legal system could not. And as attention focused on the Minters, another crucial figure was quietly shielded from deeper scrutiny. Chapter 3: Mabel Normand and the Limits of Protection. If Mary Miles Minter was treated as a convenient suspect, Mabel Normand was treated as a liability. Normand was not a rising star. She was already one of the most famous figures in silent film, a major comedic talent whose work with Mack Sennett had made her a household name. She was also struggling. By the early 1920s, Normand's career was increasingly overshadowed by rumors of substance abuse, erratic behavior, and declining reliability. Everyone in Hollywood knew this, but few were willing to say it publicly. What made Normand central to the Taylor case was proximity. She had been with William Desmond Taylor shortly before his death. By her own account, she visited him at his bungalow on the night of February 1, 1922. They spoke. She left. Sometime after, Taylor was shot. This alone should have placed her at the center of the investigation. Instead, she was handled carefully. Normand cooperated with police, but her questioning was limited and controlled. Studio representatives intervened almost immediately, arranging for her to enter medical care and shielding her from further interrogation. Public statements emphasized her ill health, her emotional fragility, and her cooperation. The message was clear. Normand was to be treated as a witness, not a suspect. There was no physical evidence linking her to the murder. No weapon. No eyewitness. No proof she returned to the bungalow after leaving. But the absence of evidence was not the same as the absence of motive, and investigators never fully explored the question of whether Normand knew more than she admitted. Hollywood had reasons to be cautious. Normand was already connected to scandal. Only a year earlier, she had been wounded in the shooting of a director friend, and her name had appeared repeatedly in drug-related rumors. Another public controversy could have ended her career entirely, and studios feared that such an outcome would deepen public hostility toward the film industry as a whole. So Normand was protected. The press followed suit. While some outlets hinted darkly at her involvement, most accepted the narrative of a tragic star undone by illness and circumstance. Sympathy replaced suspicion. Her presence at the scene became a footnote rather than a focal point. This protection came at a cost. By limiting scrutiny of Normand, investigators narrowed the scope of the case even further. Leads went unexplored. Contradictions in timelines were smoothed over. Questions that should have been pursued were quietly set aside in favor of preserving an already fragile industry. Normand's life after the murder reflected the damage nonetheless. Her health declined. Her career never fully recovered. She became a symbol of Hollywood excess and vulnerability, whether she deserved that label or not. What remains unclear is whether she was merely unlucky, or whether she carried knowledge that could have unraveled the case if allowed into the open. As suspicions settled and faded around the familiar names, other possibilities received far less attention. Possibilities that did not fit easily into headlines or moral panic. Chapter 4: The Man Who Walked Away. As Hollywood's attention fixed itself on familiar faces, one of the most troubling elements of the William Desmond Taylor murder quietly slipped into the background. A man was seen leaving the bungalow. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a figure exit Taylor's home shortly after the sound of a gunshot. Some described him walking calmly. Others said he appeared hurried but not panicked. A few claimed he stopped briefly outside before disappearing into the neighborhood. This should have been the most important lead in the entire case. Instead, it became the vaguest. Descriptions of the man varied wildly. He was tall. He was short. He was well dressed in a coat and hat. He wore rough clothing. He moved with confidence. He seemed nervous. The only consistent detail was that he was male and alone. No name was ever attached to him. No reliable composite was produced. No serious effort appears to have been made to trace his movements beyond the immediate area. Part of the problem was timing. By the time police began interviewing witnesses in earnest, the crime scene had already been compromised. The neighborhood had been flooded with reporters and curiosity seekers. Stories began to bleed into one another. Memory blurred. Certainty dissolved. But there was also a deeper issue. The man who walked away did not fit the story Hollywood was already telling. He was not a star. He was not connected to scandal. He did not provide a morality tale that could be neatly packaged and sold. Pursuing him would have meant admitting that the murder may have had nothing to do with romantic obsession or celebrity excess. It might have required asking harder questions about Taylor's private affairs, his past, and what he may have known. Some theories suggested robbery, pointing to Taylor's previous burglary and the possibility that he kept valuables or cash in his bungalow. Others suggested blackmail, perhaps connected to his hidden identity as William Dean Tanner or to knowledge of illicit activity involving drugs or studio misconduct. These theories remain speculative, but they share one important feature. They require an unknown actor. If the killer was not someone emotionally tied to Taylor, then the motive may have been transactional rather than personal. In that scenario, the calm departure described by witnesses makes sense. The killer had accomplished his goal and left without drama. Yet these possibilities were never fully developed. No serious criminal networks were investigated. No attempt was made to link Taylor's death to other crimes. The case stayed confined within Hollywood's borders, even as the evidence pointed outward. Over time, the man who walked away became a ghost. A shape without substance. A narrative inconvenience. And as attention drifted further from him, something else happened. The case itself began to cool. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved on or died. Evidence went missing. Files were closed, reopened, and quietly shelved again. What had once been an urgent murder investigation became a historical curiosity. By the time the public stopped asking who killed William Desmond Taylor, the answer, if it had ever been knowable, was already gone. Chapter 5: The Case That Would Not Stay Buried. When the official investigation into William Desmond Taylor's murder stalled, it did not end. It simply changed hands. Police interest faded quietly. Files were closed without announcement. Witnesses were no longer summoned. The unanswered questions remained, but there was no longer any institutional urgency to pursue them. Hollywood moved forward. Careers were salvaged or sacrificed. The bungalow on South Alvarado Street slipped into history. But Taylor's death refused to disappear. In the years that followed, writers, historians, and independent researchers returned to the case again and again, drawn by the same unsettling combination of certainty and absence. A man had been murdered. The evidence was real. The suspects were known. And yet nothing had been resolved. Each new examination uncovered the same problems. Missing physical evidence. Contradictory witness accounts. Police reports that seemed incomplete or evasive. Studio involvement that was never fully documented. The case became a study not just in murder, but in how power reshapes truth. One of the most intriguing later developments emerged decades after the crime, when director King Vidya allegedly undertook his own private investigation. According to accounts later explored in Cast of Killers, Vidya believed the truth of Taylor's murder had been deliberately suppressed. He interviewed surviving witnesses, reviewed documents, and collected material over many years, driven by a sense that justice had been denied. Vidya was not a detective, but he understood narrative. He understood motive. He understood how stories are constructed and how inconvenient facts are buried. His interest suggests something crucial. Those who had lived through the era did not believe the case was simply unsolvable. They believed it had been abandoned. What Vidya may have concluded remains unclear. His notes were never formally published. His investigation ended with his death. Like so much else connected to the Taylor case, it stopped just short of certainty. What remains is a haunting possibility. That the truth was known, at least in fragments, by people who chose silence over consequence. That the mystery was not protected by complexity, but by convenience. William Desmond Taylor's murder occupies a strange space in American crime history. It is endlessly documented, yet fundamentally unknowable. Every theory carries weight. Every suspect has flaws. And every explanation leaves something unanswered. In our final chapter, we will look at what Taylor's death changed, what it revealed about Hollywood, and what we believe most likely happened that night in 1922. Chapter 6: The Questions That Never Went Away. More than 100 years after William Desmond Taylor was shot and killed in his Los Angeles bungalow, the case remains unresolved not because it is incomprehensible, but because its most basic questions were never fully answered. The gaps in the investigation are not subtle. They are structural. They exist at every level, from physical evidence to motive to institutional behavior. Together, they form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as mere incompetence. The most fundamental unanswered question is also the most obvious. Who fired the gun? The murder weapon was never recovered. No verified firearm was ever conclusively matched to the bullet that killed Taylor. This is not a minor omission. In a homicide investigation, the absence of the weapon removes the single most direct link between a suspect and the act itself. Without it, every theory remains circumstantial. The disappearance of the gun suggests one of two possibilities. Either the weapon was deliberately removed from the scene by the killer or by someone else who arrived shortly after, or it was lost through gross mishandling during the earliest hours of the investigation. Both possibilities are deeply troubling. Closely tied to this is the question of timing. Witnesses could not agree on when the fatal shot was fired. Some claimed to hear a gunshot late at night. Others believed it occurred in the early morning hours. The estimated time of death shifted repeatedly, creating multiple overlapping timelines. Each version supported a different narrative and a different set of suspects. Without a firm time of death, Alibis could neither be confirmed nor definitively disproven. The case was never anchored to a single, reliable chronology. Then there is Taylor himself. What did he believe was happening in his life during those final weeks? Accounts from friends and colleagues describe him as calm, focused, and optimistic. He had future projects planned. He had meetings scheduled. There is no clear evidence that he believed he was in imminent danger. This raises an unsettling possibility. If Taylor was threatened, he either did not recognize the threat or believed it had passed. If he trusted the person who came to his door, that trust may have been fatal. Taylor's past as William Dean Tanner introduces another layer of unanswered questions. His disappearance from his former life was total and deliberate. He left behind a wife and children and never returned. Why he did this remains unclear. Whether he feared exposure, shame, or something more serious is still debated. If someone knew his true identity and intended to exploit it, that knowledge could have provided leverage powerful enough to motivate murder. Yet this angle was never seriously pursued by investigators. The mysterious man seen leaving the bungalow remains one of the most glaring unresolved elements. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man depart shortly after the presumed time of the shooting. The descriptions were inconsistent, but the reports were numerous enough to demand attention. And yet no sustained effort was made to identify him. No reliable composite was circulated. No serious canvassing appears to have followed. Whether this man was the killer, a witness, or a phantom created by rumor remains unknown because the question was effectively abandoned. Another unanswered question involves motive beyond personal relationships. The investigation quickly narrowed its focus to emotional entanglements and celebrity scandal. Robbery was largely dismissed, despite Taylor having been burglarized in the past. Blackmail was treated as speculative and uncomfortable, particularly if it involved studio misconduct or criminal networks. These possibilities required looking beyond Hollywood's familiar faces, and that look never fully happened. Finally, there is the question of interference. Studio representatives were present early. Information was filtered before reaching the public. Certain narratives were emphasized, while others were quietly ignored. Whether this amounted to a deliberate cover-up or a series of self-protective decisions is still debated. But the effect was the same. The investigation lost independence. Truth became negotiable. Taken together, these unanswered questions do not suggest a lack of clues. They suggest a lack of sustained pursuit. The case was not exhausted. It was allowed to collapse. And in that collapse, whatever certainty once existed vanished with it. Chapter 7: What Remains, and What Comes Next. By the time the investigation into William Desmond Taylor's murder finally fell silent, it had not reached an answer. It had reached exhaustion. What remained was not resolution, but residue. A body of rumors hardened into history. A set of unanswered questions left to echo across decades. A crime that everyone agreed was real, but no one seemed willing or able to finish solving. Taylor himself became secondary to the story told about him. He was reduced to a symbol. A gentleman with secrets. A victim of Hollywood excess. A footnote in the rise of studio power. The man was slowly replaced by the myth, and the myth proved easier to live with than the truth might have been. What this episode makes clear is that the failure was not a lack of suspects or theories. It was a failure of will. The investigation narrowed too quickly, deferred too often, and ultimately accepted ambiguity where persistence was required. Whether through fear, self-interest, or institutional pressure, the search for truth was allowed to end long before it had to. And yet, the case never truly disappeared. It resurfaced in books, documentaries, whispered conversations, and private investigations. It lingered because it was unfinished. Because it sat at the intersection of celebrity, crime, and power in a way that still feels modern. Because it exposed how easily justice can be bent when reputation and money are at stake. In our next and final episode, we step back and look at the full legacy of William Desmond Taylor's murder. How it reshaped Hollywood. How it influenced censorship, morality clauses, and the industry's relationship with law enforcement. How it has been portrayed and distorted across film, television, and popular culture. And then, we do something different. We take all the evidence that remains. We strip away the myths, the studio narratives, and the convenient distractions. We weigh what holds up and what does not. And we tell you what we believe actually happened. This has been AI True Crime. Next time, the legacy. Next time, the reckoning. Next time, the truth.